Thank you so much for being with us at this hour, fairly late hour. We have a stellar panel tonight to discuss transatlantic relations and the rise, or not rise, of China. We are going to leave approximately 20 minutes for a Q&A exchange, so I'll ask the speakers to be short and pithy and provocative with their comments when they start. I will start right now and turn to James Carafano.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Yep. Oh, stupid panel. Hate the whole thing. It's a dumb idea, and I wish they hadn't asked me to speak here. Look, and here's why I reject the whole premise of this discussion, because it implies this kind of old-fashioned Cold War of powers that rise and fall by establishing these hard blocks and spheres of influence that allow them to dominate and control a part of the world. That is not what's going on here. No major power in the world today has the capacity to create a sphere of influence like the United States or the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, they don't have the sustainability, the resiliency to do that. And rather than arguing about rising and falling, I think the powers that succeed in the modern world are the ones that recognize that and who don't try to turn this into a ham-fisted power competition. And I think the alternative model, which I think the US embraces, because I think the US does not have near the capacity to establish a hardened sphere of influence in the world today, is this idea that was pioneered by Abe in the free and open Pacific, this idea of connecting, of investing in connecting the pathways for like-minded nations to partner. We see the free and open Pacific. We see IMEC, which is an expansion of that, which links that through the Middle East to Europe. We see the Three Seas Initiative, the Middle Corridor, which links Central Asia and the Caucasus. When if you promote connecting these things together, what you not only do is in a sense preempt a traditional Cold War, but you rob space for powers to create these large spheres of influence. And I believe that the successful powers in the modern world are the ones that embrace that philosophy. And I put the US at the top of the list of that. And I was really excited to hear President Trump, in one of his first addresses, embrace the IMEC corridor and talk about its importance to global stability. So there you go.
Okay, let me just interject for a second. How does imposing tariff to partners and rivals work with actually building connectivity?
Yeah, on my visa, it says I'm not allowed to talk about tariffs. Here's my problem with the whole tariff thing. It's like the beginning and end of global economy is tariffs, which is absolutely complete stupid nonsense. First of all, President Biden, his term, actually imposed more tariffs than President Trump did his first term. So tariffs are not everything in the global economy. I actually think they're a very modest component of the global economy. So that's one thing. The second thing is look, Trump is driving bargains, which in the end, I think are going to be good for the United States and its partners. So I think turning this whole thing into a tariff war, and that somehow that tariff war is the litmus test on whether you embrace partnering with other countries, I just think is just stupid.
Okay, let me turn to Kishore Mahbubani. Second part of our question is, does China rise in this context?
Okay, let me begin by saying that I'm surprised I'm here, someone from Singapore, Southeast Asia, the global South, sitting with Americans and Europeans talking about Atlantis. But what I'll try to do is give you hopefully a Southeast Asian and hopefully a global South perspective in 3 points. Firstly, let there be no doubt that enormous power shifts are taking place in the world. Do have no doubt about that. And one statistic, easy one to give, in the year 1980, the European Union's combined GNP was 10 times the size of China. Today it's about the same size as China. By 2050, EU will be half the size of China. Now, when you go from being 10 times larger to becoming half the size, the world changes dramatically. And everyone is preparing themselves for these big power shifts. Secondly, it's a perfectly natural development for the number one power in the world to feel uncomfortable when the number two power starts to gain speed. And in the year 2000, the United States economy was 8 times bigger than China's. Today is about 1.5, 1.6 times larger. And you can more or less predict that even though the United States will remain number one for a long time, that China will get closer and closer. So creating the natural conditions for a geopolitical contest, as I've documented in Has China Won? And the third thing is, how will the rest of the world deal with this? And I can tell you that the rest of the world does view not just these power shifts, but frankly also the management of these power shifts with great trepidation. And for example, and this is my apologies, this is an uncomfortable point to make. There are some wars that were eminently avoidable. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal, no question. It's illegal, but it could have been avoided. If there had been some degree of geopolitical acumen, some good leadership, this war could have been avoided. So, and so from, that's why when I want to end with the one last statistic. Even though it's clear that the world disapproves of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the West imposed sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, 85% of the world's population did not impose sanctions on Russia. And if I were a European especially, I would ask myself this simple question. If it's such a black and white case of Ukraine, why is it that 85% of the world's population hasn't joined me?
Peter, I'll turn to you now, because we've had an American perspective, a global South perspective. Europeans are directly impacted by all the changes happening right now. Can you give us one perspective of how Europeans are living through this?
Yeah, I mean, if you were listening to James, then basically you see that Atlantis is actually not sinking, and whoever says that is lying. Look, Europe or European Union is an anomaly in the international community. Nobody understands how it functions. Sometimes even I don't understand how it functions. But at the end of the day, it's probably the best political experiment in the history of humankind. If you look at the single market of 500 million people, if you look at the 27 countries who try to sit at the same table and agree on difficult issues, then you can see that European Union as such is far more resilient than we give it credit for. For the last 10 years at least, wherever I go, everybody tries to bury European Union. European Union is going to be destroyed because of COVID. It's going to be destroyed because of migration, because of energy prices, because of inflation, and so on and so on. And we are still here. So it means that, although we are imperfect, we are far more resilient than other global players give us credit. So in this sense, I think also in this, highly geostrategic times where everything is changing and we are looking at a whole new reality, European Union will probably survive. And I bet you that probably European Union is going to come out stronger from this than it was right now. Because one thing that you have to understand, European Union is a process. This is why it's an anomaly. It's not a state. And as a process, it always evolves. It started as a coal integration, coal and mine integration. Then it was a peace project. Then came Schengen, single market, so on and so on. So we built up an economic giant, but it's true that we didn't build up a geostrategic giant. So this is the next step, which is waiting for us. And at the end of the day, yes, this period of time right now is Europe's Independence Day, to quote the American culture, which I like very much in the movies. So, no, but it's true. It's a good movie.
I actually
No,
I actually agree with you on the future of Europe and the movie.
Okay, all right. And maybe my final point, we are, as Europeans, it's true, because of this setup that we have, we are slow in decision-making process. but you know, I would much rather be slow and right than quick and wrong. So you know, every decision that is being made by the European Union is being made by 27 countries. This means 27 different experiences. This means 27 different positions. And this means that 27 different heads of states have to come and agree on something. And this is something which we all have to keep in mind. So just to end, I think European Union is much more resilient than we give it credit for. And also, if you look at this concept of this panel, no, and it's always like this. We are always being perceived as a prey, as a prize, as a somebody that will have to be wooed by the Chinese, by the US, by the other global players. But European Union is much more than this. And I think with the changes that are coming right now in the geostrategic community, European Union will be the one who is going to be also able to decide where it's going to move and how it's going to move and sit at the same table as all the rest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So let me turn to Teresa now. If we're going to see Europe's Independence Day, but Europe is still fairly dependent on the US for its security and on China for economics, it's weaned off from Russia for gas quite a bit, but there are these still huge two dependencies. How do we move to Independence Day? Is it even possible?
Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you, and thank you. I know it's been a very long day for a lot of you, and happy St. Patrick's Day. And I love the title. And I say that because I am a dual national, I'm Irish and American, and my family is right from the very far west of Ireland, so I have to do transatlantic relations. There's no other choice. So, and I'm based in Brussels. But I have to say, I oscillate between despair and optimism. I mean, I have never felt transatlantic relations to be in such a bad state. And I've talked, before coming here, I made all these interviews in Brussels, and here at the conference, I'm meeting people from NATO and other organizations and think tanks, and the views are all over the place. So I understand there's been a Trump shock. And the optimist in me wants to think, maybe this will really make things change in Europe, because some people are saying, Macron, buy all your weapons from France now, because you can't depend on the US. I mean, that was probably an unintended consequence of Musk telling the Ukrainians, we could turn off Starlink. And the Portuguese aren't buying the F-35s now because they're afraid that maybe there's a kill switch on it from the US. And this is one of the incredible unintended consequences. We saw the stock market for European defense industry go up, and it go down, up by 40% and down in the US by 4%. But being an optimist and looking at the longer term picture, what we need is Europe to build up their defense industry. Let's face it, for 30 years, they've had a holiday from history. And, even now they recognize, they're like, yeah, I know we live in a bubble, and since, do you remember President Obama saying, we are going to pivot to China? And the Europeans were like, well, don't you care about us anymore? And I mean, they really were sad about that. But I mean, they were giving them notice, right? Like, we're going to be pivoting, so you need to spend more money. So it was agreed that 2%, and everybody signed on to that. Only 6 countries had done it originally. With a war going on in Ukraine, they actually got up to 28. But that still means 32 out of all of the, there's a war going on for 4 years, and still some countries can't meet the 2%. And most understand they need 3.5. And I know there's polls in this room and they're at 4.7. So that's incredible. And because they increase their defense spending because they're right on the front line and they're terrified. So it depends where you sit in Europe. There's no clear policy. There's 27 countries in Europe with 27 different policies, unfortunately. But we did see great cohesion at the recent summit, and they moved around Orban. So 26 versus Orban. So I think that's an interesting development. 3 points. So the first one is about the unintended consequence of defense spending. But in the long term, this could be a really positive thing. And 85 years of cooperation shouldn't be thrown under the bus because of someone saying that they really dislike the EU or raising concerns about NATO. He's not going to be around forever. So I think we might think of it as a divorce, or someone had an affair and they're considering a divorce. And but you have some children, and those children are trade and the incredible business activity between these two partners. And so there's a great deal of dependency. Now, I've seen some weird things going on, like I call it the jealous girlfriend syndrome. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen at Davos said, you know what, folks, we can have better trade with China. And so I don't know if this is their strategy. I call it like strategic pick-me approach, but I mean, there are three mistakes in strategic foresight that the Europeans were remiss on. And let's remember, the number one voice in Europe was always like, we don't do geopolitics. You know, they're a peace project. They don't have to think about geopolitics, which I think is a strange way to approach the world. So all of a sudden, all these bureaucrats who always use that as an excuse, oh, we don't do geopolitics, don't ask us that question. Under Ursula von der Leyen, she created the Geopolitical Commission. So overnight, everybody had to grow some geopolitical muscles, and bureaucrats who had used that excuse for so long, it was kind of hard. So now they're the Defense and Security Commission, and that's in every chapter. Get ready, we're getting a new white paper on Friday about defense. So every strategy now, that's the thread through all the documents. So I think we've seen a slow but necessary evolution, but there's also a personality question. What is the EU? They were a peace project mugged by reality. Now, what's going to happen to them? And we have in the same city, NATO, and we're seeing some interesting evolution in the relationship. So I think the EU needs to figure out what they're doing and how they might cooperate with NATO, or how the relationship shall unwind. But so I mentioned defense, and then underestimating the pivot to Asia, and then not taking their defense requirements seriously, because every president has said you need to increase defense spending. And for 30 years, this hasn't happened. The defense base has atrophied, and Europe is really in a difficult situation. So I'm looking at the clock, and I will just try to end up, I wish I had some of that Red Bull, Jim. My God, did you take it with you on the plane? It's incredible. So I loved how this is called Kala Chakra, the idea of the wheel of time. And I wanted to start with the quote by Gramsci, but I know he upsets people. But I think it kind of fits with this a bit. The old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So the existing structures are failing. Even anything that's 85 years old, something's going to be creaky and not working. So it needs reform and it needs to improve. And the future is uncertain. But I really feel that there's this catalytic conversion in Europe now. And we were talking before, and he was saying, maybe it's good that things are happening so fast that this will propel Europe to really make some tough decisions and show leadership on the international stage. So I hope that we can bring peace to Ukraine, and that Donald Trump might find some minerals on Atlantis. And leave Greenland alone. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That felt like a...
If we pick up from where Teresa left, then that existing structures are failing. Your vice chairman of the Munich Security Conference, the speech that the US Vice President J.D. Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference this year was described in Washington by quite a few people as one of the most consequential speeches on the transatlantic relationship in the past few years. I'm wondering, what's your perspective as the head of one of the largest security cooperation conferences, how you see the transatlantic relationship evolving, and whether you see a role for China as well in this context?
Thank you so much for having me. You know, I thought I was pretty damn good at provocative panel openings. But dumb idea, hate the whole thing. Jim, you're the new front runner on that. I love that. But had I gone first, I would have said the whole Atlantis thing doesn't really work, because Atlantis, this great culture dominating everything else, fell because of an external factor, some, magical natural disaster. If our current Atlantis falls, it's because of ourselves. And that is something that J.D. Vance did say in his speech in Munich, which, you may not like some of the content, You may not like the examples that he used. You may not like the delivery, or like me, you may not like the fact that he didn't take any questions afterwards. But, and by the way, the Chinese foreign minister who spoke directly after him, he took questions and didn't stop. That was quite a sign too. But you know, if you judge a speech by its effect and whether it achieves its intended purpose, then this was an incredibly effective and successful speech. By the way, this speech, and you know, I was greeted in the hallways by people, or with people saying to me, "Congratulations on ending the Western Alliance." You know, well done, Munich Security Conference. Can I just point out that just as Peter has rightly said, that Europe is actually a lot stronger than people, particularly at this conference, want to believe. The transatlantic relationship is a lot stronger than people here in the hallways seem to believe. We're here to stay. Yes, this is a difficult moment, but it's not the first in the relationship. Have we all suddenly, you know, forgotten about previous bumps in the road? Have we forgotten that the transatlantic relationship was pretty tough during the years of the Vietnam War? That the transatlantic relationship was pretty tough at the end of the Cold War? That it was pretty tough during the Bosnian Wars? We seem to have, you know, come to the conclusion that the transatlantic relationship has been perfect and that now, you know, the good times are over. I think the exact opposite is the case. And I should have said at the beginning that's my personal opinion and not the opinion of the Munich Security Conference or the current or future German government. But I think, yeah, I think what you're going to see is not just Europe that comes out of this stronger. You will see a transatlantic relationship that is coming out of this stronger. Because over the past couple of years, we Europeans in particular have failed to take Americans along. We have failed to explain the net benefits of that wonderful alliance. And I think we have woken up, if to anything, to the need to make sure that the American voters, the American population understands why this alliance is so crucial and why it's worth keeping it. And for that, we Europeans need to create additional benefits. And there are ways to do that. It is obvious that we need to do more on defense, but it is also obvious that we need to help the current US administration and add some new dynamism to global governance, to push some of the reforms, to uncrust some of the crusted structures. And I do believe that, you know, even if I may not like the tone of the US administration at all times, the problematic thing for Europeans is that with many points, they hit the nail on their head. And so I believe, as you know, in a couple of years, we will look back at Europe's Independence Day. This doesn't necessarily mean a weaker transatlantic alliance. It just means an expanded transatlantic alliance, a deeper transatlantic alliance, and hopefully one that will continue to include Canada and Greenland as their own entities. Thank you.
Okay, we're almost at 15 minutes, so I'm going to turn to the audience now. Anyone who wants to ask a question, please introduce yourself and keep it to a question, no comments, please. And if you're addressing it to someone in particular in the panel, please say it. Yes, I don't know if we have mics circulating. Oh, no, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Alicia Garcia Herrero. I'm also European, and I have a question for the Europeans in the room. And I also have a question for Kishore. The question for the Europeans is, so we did everything right, and you know everything that is happening to us now from the US administration, it's just our fault, if I hear you correctly. No? Okay, so could you elaborate on that? Because that doesn't sound like what I've heard.
I only had 3 minutes, so
yeah,
I did
that's fine.
compress
Okay,
it a
so
little.
please, you know, do elaborate on what the US is doing beyond asking us to spend more on defense. Because there's many other things that are unrelated to spending on defense. The second thing for Kishore, sorry, I drank some wine, so now I'm like, all of my names are flirting in my head. So you said that at some point, and this is a change, I think, from what I've heard you say before, at some point, China will be bigger than the US. Probably. You added probably. President Xi Jinping, I think you yourself, but I leave it there, actually said before COVID that China would be bigger than the US by 2027, in 2 years. The clock is clicking, and China is not going to be bigger than the US by no means and purposes, for many reasons that you know very well. Structural deceleration, deflation, and frankly, I doubt China will ever be bigger than the US. So the question now is, you said it, you know, we Europeans will be half the size of China. I don't think that's actually true either, but of course smaller than China. There I agree. And that is an amazing shift. So now my question is, what is China going to do when it sees its GDP actually go downwards versus the US? How is China going to take that after that impression that it would be the largest economy in the world?
I'm going to ask the panelists to hold their fire. We'll take a couple more. Yes, the gentleman behind and the lady afterwards, please.
Thank you. Yes, can you hear me? There was an observation about, during the Obama administration, the pivot to China. I just want to clarify, I believe the policy position at that time was in fact a Pacific pivot, not a China pivot. You did explicitly. And I just want to acknowledge that nuance, but also ask the panel as a whole what it means for the United States to not consider or describe itself as a transatlantic, primarily perspective, but a Pacific state, with implications perhaps for the Indo-Pacific focus also of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Xenia Wickett Advisory. Just picking up on Benedict's comment, which is, I agree, there is a scenario where the transatlantic relationship is stronger. But there's a really dangerous, vulnerable period before we get there, when America's, and I'm using very simplistic language to make the point, when America's withdrawn, but Europe hasn't stepped up, or allies, so to Kishore, you know, allies, Singapore, Japan, South Korea haven't stepped up, and there is a void. And there are other countries that may be less palatable to many in the room, like China, like Russia, who will fill that void in the absence of somebody else. So I'd be quite interested from all the panelists, how do we manage the next, say, decade or so, during which America's withdrawing, but other allies haven't yet got the capacity to step up? I'd be interested in everybody's view.
Thanks. So let's start in reverse. Benedict, you can go.
But just to clarify what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is that we haven't done enough as Europeans. We haven't communicated well enough as Europeans. And as Europeans, we've also not taken long-standing US concerns seriously enough. That isn't the same as it's all our fault, but it is, I believe, pretty simplistic to put all of the blame on US administration that speaks its mind, maybe not in the way that we Europeans would like to hear, but I do believe that a lot of the concerns that we're hearing from President Trump, not always articulated particularly well, do have some legitimacy. And we Europeans would do well in acknowledging that. That's not the same thing as agreeing. But if he is worried about, China at the Panama Canal, we shouldn't ridicule that. We should look at it. There are, by the way, channels to deal with things like that, international global mechanisms. So we should encourage the US when they are worried about something, when they are concerned about something, to use the channels that, together with the US, we've all built up over the last 75 years. So again, I'm not agreeing with everything he says, but Europe is certainly to blame for a lot of it. And I stand to that. Maybe, Xenia, to you, I think you're absolutely right. There is a period between us realizing that we need to do more and us actually having done more and thus being safer. I don't have a good answer on how that period is going to go. But let me just say one thing that drives me mad in discussions like this. I don't see anyone else stepping up globally. Where is China? Where is India? Where is Brazil when it comes to reforming this world? Where are they when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine? You know, it's so easy to keep talking, but I don't really see them. I am yet to meet a Brazilian or an Indian or in a second comfort, or a Chinese diplomat who articulates a clear alternative vision. And we have seen over the last decades a lot of criticism of the liberal rules-based international order, but where's the alternative? So here we go, comfort.
I was only simply going to say, Benedict, the question is whether you accept those other proposals as having equal weight as the other side. And that is the challenge, because China and South Africa worked together. Brazil at one point worked together. The parts of the BRICS came together, but there is a real question as to whether you see those as valuable, and whether you see them as respectful alternatives, or whether you believe them as not as seen as Putin whispering as well. So there is a question mark about how you view the credibility or the integrity of the other side. That's the only thing I wanted to say. But we have to acknowledge that they did put different peace proposals on the table as well. I mean, you can question whether but I think we should acknowledge first that there were alternatives. So that's all I wanted to say. Sorry to be seething.
Thank you so much for that question, and I do apologize. The pivot to Asia, it was Shinzo Abe that came up with the term Indo-Pacific, and then it was adopted by the U.S. administration. Europeans didn't touch Indo-Pacific because they thought it was too heavy with luggage, that it had too much impact, and now they can say Indo-Pacific. So there has been, big movement. And so this idea, I am afraid, under Biden, after Trump 1.0, and there was a lot of alienation, and then Biden came in and he was trying to realign allies to support the U.S. position on the Indo-Pacific. And I think Biden had made a breakthrough that U.S. and the EU were there was a convergence that was taking place on Indo-Pacific policies. And I think that's gone now. That's going to be a casualty. Maybe it will come back later, but I think now that's finished, at least for the time being. And then I have to address what some people have called the NATO paradox, that by underspending, it keeps the U.S. in Europe. I don't know, maybe you have a view on that, but I heard this at a conference. I'm like, that's the first time I heard that excuse. But I think that they didn't take it very serious, that the U.S. is like warning them, you should prioritize these weapon systems because should, God forbid, a war happen, we're going to need this heavy lift equipment. We're going to have to take this stuff with us. So start investing in this equipment now. And that really hasn't been taking place. So the cheap riding or the free riding, I think that really irritated a lot of people who were quite balanced in the past, and they just keep seeing, and the price of things getting so expensive in the US, like education. I think that all had a knock-on effect. And I think maybe it wasn't communicated, but they had, 14 years to get their act together, and it really didn't happen. So I think there was a lot of growing anger, and Trump has tapped into that with the public. And then, and I mean, this type of language is not helpful when Trump says things like, the EU was designed to screw America. I mean, I'm sorry, that's not the case at all. And the US supported it. And sometimes I wonder, why does he hate it so much? And I had this, just by chance, I was at a dinner and I saw Phil Hogan. I'm like, wow, it wouldn't be great if I sat next to him. And he ended up like sitting next to me. This name card was right next to me. So I just picked his brain. He's Irish. He used to be the trade commissioner, and he was a politician. He was the greatest storyteller. So all these EU commissioners were meeting Trump when he was president, and they're all, trying to think of something interesting to say. And so he said, hey, we got something in common. And Trump's like, piqued his attention. He's like, what is it? And he said, Don bag. And I'm like, and everyone at the table was laughing because it was in Ireland. And I'm like, excuse me, I have no idea. What is Don bag? What does that mean? And it was Trump's golf course. So from then on, Phil Hogan was called Don bag. Trump just left an impression. But what happened at that golf course might have soured relations with the EU, because Trump wanted to build a wall to stop the erosion of the golf course into the sea, and EU rules and regulations wouldn't let him do that. And I often wonder, is that like where it all went pear-shaped? I mean, what an awful way for things. For he has this impression, maybe a very negative impression of the EU, but maybe we'll find out one day. So I'll
multilateralism and how everything is being destroyed and unraveled. And basically, what Natalie Toci said was that we are going into the period of the law of the jungle. But it was interesting what Minister Jashankar said, and don't quote me even if it's recorded. I'm not going to say it word by word, but what he said was, I don't believe that we are entering into the law of the jungle, but even if we are, I would much rather take this law of the jungle than live in the cage which was built by the Westerners for the Westerners. Which is interesting. Also when it comes to what Benedict was saying. Yes, European Union, being European Union, needs multilateralism to thrive because of all the things that we were discussing right now, because we are different than nation states. But if we need multilateralism, this means that we have to be the ones to build it up again on some other principles that the multilateral system was built until now. Because geostrategy changed. There are new global players, and we need to realize that. If we don't, then the one who is going to hurt the most is going to be European Union. So what I'm expecting in the next 10 years is for European Union to lead when it comes to multilateral system. I would like to see Europe, who is going to be much more integrated, with probably we would be voting for the president of European Union in European elections, and of course, we would be much stronger and bigger with the Western Balkans and Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova inside of the EU. Thank you.
Well, I hope you'll extend the clock a bit to give James a chance. Two questions. One is about China. Will China overtake the US? I don't think Xi Jinping ever said he would get it there by 2027, but that's irrelevant anyway. Now, number one, I would say that whatever China does, it must never underestimate the United States. It's a remarkably dynamic and powerful economy that continues to astonish the world. And as you know, in the year 2000, EU and US were the same size. Today, EU is 2/3 the size of the United States. But at the same time, I would say it would also be a mistake to underestimate China. Now, China is going through 2 or 3 bad years now. And there are lots of domestic problems, property, consumer sentiment, business sentiment, and so on and so forth. But if you want to understand the Chinese economy, you must always slice it decade by decade and ask yourself, where will China be not 1 or 2 years from now? Where will it be 10 years from now? And are they achieving their long-term goals? So just give you a simple example. In the year 2000, China's share of global manufacturing was 5%. By 2030, China's share of global manufacturing will be 45%. That's an indication of the long-term transformation. Secondly, if you had come to this room 10 years ago when Raisina Dialogue began, and someone in this room said, watch out, 10 years from now, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen would all be very worried by Chinese automobiles, everyone in the room would have laughed. As recently as 3 years ago, Elon Musk laughed about Chinese vehicles. And guess what? Everyone is now afraid that Chinese vehicles can take over the world. So whatever you do, the Chinese always work on a long-term time frame. And it doesn't matter whether it happens 2027, 2037, they're going to get there. But they're acutely aware that it's going to be difficult because the United States itself is a very dynamic economy. So that's my point to you. Very quickly on the global south and Ukraine, if I can respond. I think you're being a bit unfair to China, India, and Brazil. You know, the general view is that if you created the problem, and as I said, by not, in a sense, avoiding a war that could have been avoided, then you're saying to the rest of the world, why aren't you taking care of it? And by the way, for the record, some Global South leaders did speak out. And if I remember correctly, the current president of Indonesia, when he was defense minister, gave a speech in Shangri-La Dialogue, and in which he did call for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And he was completely poo-pooed by every European leader. And guess what? If you read carefully what Donald Trump is doing now, in some ways, Donald Trump is reviving General Prabowo's proposal, which is that let's go for a ceasefire first. And incidentally, I'm told, I met a friend of Donald Trump, and he told me that Donald Trump's view about the Ukraine war is that if you lost it in the battlefield, why are you asking me to gain it back from you? You lost it. So you have to deal with the losses. So the fact that someone like President Trump has that attitude, I think also reflects the view of many in the rest of the world. But just finally on Ukraine, what the rest of the world wants to see is at the end of the day a fair and just solution that takes care of the interests of all the key parties, and that's how you get a fair and just solution. And of course, Ukrainian interests must be protected in any settlement.
Okay, so I now go on to talk for an hour and a half about my intense optimism with Europe and the transatlantic community. But I'll just do the pivot thing, right? Which is, again, it's stupid, right? We've had 4 American presidents that were all going to pivot to China. The only reason why they didn't say China and they said Asia is because they were afraid to say China. But these are very different presidents, Republicans, Democrats, and every single one of them never pivoted to Asia. And the reason for that is really simple. The United States has vital interests in the Pacific. It has vital interests in the Middle East. It has vital interests in Western Europe. And in the end, it's not going to compromise any of them. So no American president ever pivots anywhere. If you look at Donald Trump, what is Donald Trump doing today? He is in Beijing going toe-to-toe with Xi. Oh, no, he's not. He's in the Middle East. He started in the Middle East, supporting Israel, pushing back on Iran, pushing back on the Houthis. He immediately started whacking terrorists right and left that Biden was afraid to whack for years. And now he's beating the hell out of the Houthis. So apparently we're not pivoting from the Middle East. And let's be honest, what has he done on Europe in practical terms since he's been in office? He's been the strongest advocate for increasing European defense, which every European acknowledges they absolutely have to do. He has been the strongest advocate for changing policies which are actually making Europe less competitive, particularly their energy policies. And he has committed his entire presidency on pushing for an end to the fighting in Ukraine. Now, if he was going to abandon Europe, these would be really stupid things. So all Donald Trump has proven so far is he's a really, really bad isolationist. And since he doesn't own Canada or Panama or Greenland yet, he's not a very good imperialist either. So thanks.
Wow, you can thank everyone. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.